Class of 2020, has everybody signed in? Yes, okay, does everybody have a blank sheet of paper? Okay, so we're gonna get started. We're running a little bit late, so we'll go quick. By show of applause, how many people were here for last week's summer session? And by show of applause, how many people are here from Amador? Please stop. And how many people here are here from Foothill? Thank you. All right, so about half and half. That is excellent. So this is the second summer session. For those of you who were not here last week, we all here from Californians Advanced Civic Education. I'm sure that Ms. Farr and Mr. Dunmore and Mr. McBride have mentioned who we are, but we are an organization of volunteers. It's a nonprofit that's set up specifically to help folks like you get through the beautiful both sides. Provide volunteering and financial support to programs throughout this. We've been running summer sessions like these for around 6 years. So it's a great way to give people a little bit of a head start, but also get to know you guys a little bit and let you know that we are here as resources for you going forward. My name is Clint Woods. I'm an attorney in San Francisco. In my day job, I'm also president of Californians Advanced Civic Education. I am an alum of the program from 1995 from Amador Valley High School. We won the national title. I'm going to mention it a lot. I will allow everybody else to introduce themselves, starting with the most important person in the room.
Hi, I'm Heather Zakaria. This is my law firm, but not really, because I have no part of or really any profit from it. Most important. I do employment and benefits law, so litigation primarily, and some of our clients are familiar with, like University of California, Court of California, Fashion Institute, which is merchandising. So touch all corners, all sizes, but education. So welcome. Just some quick announcements. There's some drinks and stuff in the back. We can bring out more if needed. Bathrooms are back over by where you entered.
Yeah, so everybody give Ms. Ferrier a round of applause. It's actually a giant pain in the ass to let all of us use this space, so I appreciate the amount of time and effort. Let us do it. So, Sabrina?
Hello, I'm Sabrina McGraw. I'm an alum of the program in 2013. I'm a current rising PL at Berkeley Law School. Really excited.
Don't have to applaud everybody. It's going to take too long. Sorry.
I'm Suva. I am not a lawyer. I'm a data scientist for Gapping, like building company, and I'm an alum of class of 2011.
I'm David Martinez. I'm a history and government teacher at Irvington High School. I've been the coach of Irvington's team for the last couple of years, but I just had a baby, so I had to step down this year. We couldn't find anybody to take over, so that's why Irvington's on a little bit of a hiatus, but they'll be back. I'm an alumni of the program, class of 2003, Unit 2. Yeah, I'm happy to be here to work with you today.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I was alumni of the program 2014, Unit 6. Yeah, now I'm a hacker for Accenture.
Hey everyone, my name is Vikram Srikanti. I'm also an alumni of the program from 2012. I went to Foothill at Unit 3, and I am now a PhD student in computer science at
Yay! Okay. And then you will notice that there's a bunch of people sitting in the back of the room. They are alumni who are here to help out today. We appreciate them coming. I do want to highlight two people from Irvington High School over there. You guys want to raise your hands? You'll note the reason why I'm highlighting this is that there are no students from our Irvington here. Whereas unlike the Foothill and Amador kids, which we appreciate, these folks are here helping you guys out. It's not like they're helping their former school. They're not getting, any kind of credit for it. That is civic responsibility, civic duty. I appreciate that. So before we get started, everybody has a blank sheet of paper. We made name placards out of these last week. We're gonna do the same thing, but because I didn't print it out, on the other side of the name placards, so the name placards are gonna be folded in thirds. You write your name, you write your school. If you want to let us know your pronouns, that's cool, please do so. If you don't have a sheet of paper, please come up and grab one. On the other side, I want you to write 4 questions. Write down 4 questions. So not on the side with your name, on the other side of the paper, 4 questions. 4 questions are, what worked for you in this session? Please write them down. So that's what worked for you in this session. What didn't work for you in this session. That's what didn't work for you. Great. So we're starting to record. What do you hope to learn going forward? That's what do you hope to learn going forward? And finally, anything else you want us to know. So, what worked for you in this session, what didn't work for you in this session, what do you hope to learn going forward, and anything else you want us to know. So with that, last week we learned a little bit about the branches of government. We decided that, against my better wishes, that the executive was the most powerful branch of government. We also learned about the program, how a hearing works. You're going to get an example of a We the People hearing in a little bit. But we learned about some of the ways that judges score you. We focused on participation, responsiveness, and understanding. So I'm going to turn it over to Vikram, who's going to talk about the other scoring categories.
Okay, fine. Okay, so there's 3 other criteria on this score sheet. So last week, like Mr. Woods mentioned, we talked about understanding, responsiveness, and participation. We're still gonna, we want you to remember all the things that we told you last week, and you're gonna get, you're gonna get some handouts that will explain, will give you, will show you the score sheet, and then explain to you what each one of the criteria means. So for those of you who weren't here last week, you should briefly read those 3, the understanding, responsiveness, and participation criteria, because those are easy points, especially the responsiveness and participation. So you should make sure you're familiar with that. But today we're going to talk about a little bit more of the substance-based scoring criteria, which are constitutional application, reasoning, and supporting evidence. So, I mean, the title of the program is We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution. So we expect you to be familiar and conversant with the Constitution in a fairly meaningful way. So constitutional application is a criteria that helps us quantify how much you brought your questions, your answers in the Q&A session, how much you brought those things back to the actual Constitution. Are you able to talk about what are the constitutional principles that underlie your argument? What are the actual clauses in the Constitution that support the arguments that you're making? And this, I mean, so an easy way to do this is to talk about actual things in the Constitution. You can say, like, Article 1, Section 8 tells us what Congress is allowed to do, and Article 1, Section 9 tells us what Congress isn't allowed to do, and so on. And those are always good places to start. But constitutional application doesn't just mean you have to cite particular phrases from the Constitution. It also means talking about the principles that underlie the Constitution. So can you talk about, for example, what did James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention say? Why did they make a decision they made to do something or to also not include something in the Constitution? Can you look at the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers and say, here's the reasoning that explains a particular part of the Constitution? Can you look at even jurisprudence? Can you look at either common law tradition, or can you look at decisions made by the Supreme Court and explain how those relate to the Constitution and what the constitutional principles are. Those are the kinds of things that will get you good constitutional applications. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about that? Okay, cool. So the next one is supporting evidence. Supporting evidence is going to be a really important one, and you're all going to suck at this when you start, and we're going to tell you over and over and over again that you don't have enough evidence, and you're going to get really mad at us for saying it, but we're going to keep saying it, and eventually you'll get better at it. Supporting evidence basically just means that you can't say, I think X, and have that say. You can't say, I think President Trump is that. Okay, I don't care what you think. You need to tell me why, right? You need to tell me, here's my argument. Here's a smart person, like maybe a law professor or a writer or a philosopher who agrees with my argument. And here's a specific piece of, historical fact or jurisprudence or whatever that backs up my argument. This is broader than just constitutional application. These can be things like current events. These can be historical events. This can be things, if you're in Unit 6, for example, this might be comparative politics. You might understand how a different government structures their constitution and compare it to how our government structures its constitution. There's a very wide variety of things that fall into the supporting evidence category. But the main point here is that you can't just have opinions. You need to have facts, concrete things that relate to your opinions that tell us that it's not just your opinion, but it's your opinion informed by a certain thing that happened in the world somewhere that we can point to and understand why things are the way they are. So, in a lot of cases, especially, and this really depends on the unit that you're in. For example, if you're in Unit 5 and you're talking about a lot of court cases, a lot of your supporting evidence will also tie into the constitutional application score. But they're not always related, and there are things that will fall into one and not the other. You'll get a feel for these things as you go, but you need to make sure that you're not just saying, I think and I feel, because that is a thing that we see over and over again, and we will beat it out of people. Okay, yeah.
Are there any types of evidence that you don't like, perhaps?
Right. So one thing that that folks like to do sometimes is to talk about personal experience. This is what we call anecdotal evidence sometimes. Did you hand this out?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, cool. Great. So you have another thing here that tells you a bunch of different kinds of evidence that you might be able to use. So these are things that we've covered already. They're things like philosophy. So if you're in Unit 1 or Unit 2, you might talk about the philosophical underpinnings that date back to John Locke, or even some Greek philosophers that refer to specific things that they said about the way governments work. There's history, there's laws and policies, current events, case law, statistics. Oh, that's a good one that I forgot to mention. Statistics are a great way to back up your point. So if you're talking about policy today, and you're saying, you're talking about immigration law, for example, it would be very helpful if instead of just saying immigration is a real problem or illegal immigration is a real problem in the United States, it would be much better to say something like, in the last 20 years, we've seen X million people cross the border illegally. So that's a very simple example of a statistic that helps ground your arguments. You're not just saying, hey, I feel like it's a problem. Here's actually a quantification of how much it's a problem and why we should care about that. Polling is a very good example of this. There's going to be tons of studies that you'll come across when you're doing your research that will, there's a very wide variety of ways to bring statistics into this stuff. The last one is personal stories and anecdotes. And this is a really common thing that we hear from time to time, that folks like to say, in my experience or in my city, we do things in a certain way. And we sort of have a tendency to scoff at this a little bit. And the reason is because personal stories and anecdotes can be very powerful. If you're talking about immigration and your family came to this country as immigrants and have a meaningful story to tell there, it can be a really useful way to present evidence. But the common way that personal stories and anecdotes are used is somewhat not helpful, right? If you're talking about the way that things are done in Pleasanton or in Fremont, that's not necessarily very representative or informative about policy that we should be developing for the rest of the country or the way that the framers envisioned our government work. So you can use anecdotes, but be very careful with when you're using anecdotes. Make sure they're really relevant. Make sure you're not just talking about, this one time I was at Safeway and I saw this person. Like, don't tell those kinds of stories. Make sure it's very relevant. Make sure it's making a very concrete point, because otherwise you sort of end up in this rambling storytelling mode that isn't going to support your point in a meaningful way and will sort of make you sound a little silly if you're not careful.
Yeah, my favorite example of that is I was judging at state several years ago, and there was I think I was judging Unit 5. And I asked a question about the Fourth Amendment, and somebody responded, and it was, I forget which school it was. It wasn't any of you guys, of course. But it was, somebody said, well, my dad's a police officer, and he says these types of searches are perfectly constitutional. And I was like, I don't care, right? Like, that's nice that your dad is a police officer, and that's fine. But he is not an authority that, he's not a Supreme Court justice. He's a police officer. He's probably, trained in the Fourth Amendment to a certain extent. But it's an anecdote that doesn't move the ball in, right? So, and it felt like he was just trying to say, hey, my dad's a cop, and that's cool. Which is, good for you, but it doesn't, there's no place on the score sheet for that. So, so keep that in mind.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions about evidence or constitutional application, anything like that? Cool. Okay. So the last criteria is reasoning. This one, in some sense, is kind of the hardest criteria to make sure that you're hitting. And the point here is that you aren't just regurgitating facts. You aren't just coming up to the testimony and reciting a list of historical events and case law and facts and philosophers' names without really tying them together in any meaningful way. The whole point here is that, again, this is a congressional testimony. And so that means that you are presenting to the judges as an expert on the topic that you are talking about, whether that's, history, philosophy, current events, whatever the question is asking you to reason about, you are supposed to be an expert on that topic, which means that you aren't just going to say, like, in 18 whatever year, a certain thing happened. You need to tell me why that's relevant to the question that's being asked, whether that's in the testimony or in the Q&A. You need to explain why it's relevant. You need to explain what about the piece of evidence or constitutional citation that you're using makes your argument dependent, right? So you need to be able to synthesize across, you need to be able to synthesize across the evidence that you're providing. You need to be able to explain the argument that you're making, both independently, but also how it relates to the evidence that you're providing. So being able to bridge the different pieces of evidence, being able to explain how it ties back to the question, and presenting really a coherent argument. What this is about is how well are you presenting your argument, how are you explaining yourself, and how are you explaining how the evidence that you're providing is relevant to the answer that you're trying to get. Not just an individual person, but across the whole unit. Right? One person is, one person may provide a piece of evidence, and another person may explain why that evidence relates to, the umbrella question of the testimony or another piece of evidence they're providing. This is not like an individual criteria. This is really for the whole unit to reason together about whatever argument. Any questions about the score sheet in general? Cool.
Okay. So thank you, Vikram. The next thing that we're going to be doing, so last week we talked mostly about content that was relevant to units 2 and 4. We talked about the branches of government. And what we wanted to do is one of the hardest things that, one of the hardest bits of content that people have like wrapping their head around as they get started is sort of classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy. This is a thing that it permeates all 6 units. It's a thing that is endemic to the We the People program. So we are very, very lucky to have Mr. Martinez, who is here to teach us about some philosophical concepts. All right.
All right, sounds good. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. Bear with me 1 second. Keep going. All right. So yes, I'm a little rusty. It's been a few months since I've presented. So we're gonna go quick. We don't got a whole lot of time, so I'm gonna be moving fast through the PowerPoint. So again, if there's any questions at any point though, please don't hesitate to ask. All right. So Unit 1. The philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. So just real quick, how many of you are interested in being a part of Unit 1? Okay, good. So more than I was anticipating. So that's great. So I'll give you my quick Unit 1 pitch. What I love most about Unit 1 is you get to become a founder and a framer in essence. Unit 1's all about acquiring the knowledge that the framers and the founders acquired themselves and acquired knowledge that they used in order to basically create their own government for themselves. And I think that's really, really cool. You know, if you've studied U.S. history, which all of you have, you know that we get amendments in clusters. And I think we're living in a time where we're due to see new amendments. We have some real challenges that face our democratic republic. And so it's really important that we all sort of think like the framers thought. It's going to take constitutional ingenuity and out-of-the-box thinking, I think, for our generation and your generation to sort of come up with unique solutions, constitutional solutions to the challenges that face the republic today. So with that in mind, it makes it really fun to study Year 1. So that's my little pitch to you all. All right, so really quick, because context matters, what historical developments influenced the founders' ideas on government? So we're just going to go very briefly through some of these historical developments. So first, we're going to have the Middle Ages, roughly the 5th to the 14th centuries. What we're going to have is the creation of really feudalism throughout Europe. And in particular, Great Britain is going to adopt a feudal system of government based on lordships. Really what's going to happen is we're going to end up with a fairly rigid patriarchal hierarchy in which the lords own land and the peasants and serfs work the land. Eventually, the feudal systems throughout Europe and in Great Britain in particular are going to create the conditions which we can see limited monarchy form in Great Britain and in England. Again, if you've studied Unit 1, you know that the American constitutional system is based upon the British constitutional system. And it's here during the Middle Ages that we're going to see this system form. The feudal system is also going to create land issues that eventually, after the enclosure movement, are going to lead to thousands and thousands of English peasants moving to the New World in various forms. So, the Middle Ages. The Renaissance, roughly the 15th through the 17th centuries. We're going to have a rebirth of art, culture, history during this time period as the Western world begins to move out of the Middle Ages and begins to modernize. And we'll come back to some other developments that happened during the Renaissance that are going to be really important when we're talking about the transfer of information. How do we get ancient information from antiquity to the founders in the 18th century? Right, so we're going to be going there in just a few moments. The Reformation in the 16th century. So as you know, we have a rich Judeo-Christian tradition in this country. At least many parts of our constitutional system are based upon Judeo-Christian values. So what we're going to get, the Reformation in the 16th century, we're essentially going to see the Catholic Church start to break up and dissolve in some places. With the advent of the printing press, the Bible being translated and then printed into different languages, we're going to see the birth of non-Catholic Christian denominations. It's going to spread throughout the world, beginning in Europe. The Reformation is going to lead directly to the English Reformation between 1529 and 1558, when we're going to see the King of England formally break away from the Catholic Church, form the Anglican Church. And again, many of our framers and founders are members of the Anglican Church in the British colonies during the 18th century. In the 1600s, we're going to see the birth or the rise of sort of the nation state after the Peace of Westphalia. We are going to get the birth of sort of modern international relations, modern forms of economy, modern forms of trade. So again, during this time period, we're going to see the Western world, really transform into one divided up amongst nation states. Again, we're going to have the birth of capitalism during this time period. And in many ways, capitalism, the idea of free markets, are going to correspond very well with ideas of liberty, particularly like freedom in the economy to produce the goods you want to produce. So again, capitalism is going to resonate in the colonies. It's going to resonate with the founders and the framers. And so birth of capitalism is going to be an important step as well. And then, of course, the Enlightenment, the 18th century. It's going to be the birth of modern science, mathematics, and really this heightened age of reason. The framers and the founders are children of the Enlightenment. They're sort of that last generation of the Enlightenment. And what they're going to do is they're going to use all of the sort of information that they've been able to gather over the course of the 1700s and put it to good use. There's going to be this new science of politics that arises during the Enlightenment. And of course, the founders themselves are constitutional scholars. They created their own constitutions. They were experts, or maybe not experts, but they created. They were craftsmen, right? They had actual practical first-hand experiences in self-government, in creating government. And that shouldn't be lost. It's really, really quite important. When the revolution begins, when they start drafting state constitutions, they already have practical experience in self-government and in constitutional scholarship. So those are some major developments. If you're in Unit 1, you're definitely going to have to be well-versed, I think, in these historical developments, and be able to tie them together in Unit 1. So what I do is about classical republicanism influenced the founders. So classical republicanism, it's going to come from antiquity. Primarily, classical republicanism is going to be this sort of idea on government and society that's going to go back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, right? Publica basically means the thing of the people. So when we're talking about republics, we're talking about the governments or the things of the people. In classical republican society, the most important aspect is the society itself, the health and the vigor of that society. So education's prominent in classical republican society, just like it's going to be prominent in natural rights philosophy and theory. But the point of education in classical republican society is going to be to protect the advantages of the state, to maintain security and defense of the state first and foremost. And we're going to get into a little more about what classical republican societies look like here in just a moment. So some aspects of classical republican society. Small, homogeneous, self-contained communities. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, that's really what we're going to see for the most part, at least when we're talking about societies of citizens. And we're going to talk about sort of the rigid citizenship that went along with classical republican societies. Again, primary focus on education to provide for the health, vigor, sustainability, defense, and stability of the community. Wise, deliberate rule with a focus on reason, civic virtue, and of course, strong defense. Two terms should be synonymous with classical republicanism. And the one is civic virtue, and the other is citizenship. Anybody know what does civic virtue mean, roughly translated? Civic virtue.
Guesses?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's not far off. Okay, that's part of it. But public good. Okay, so when you're thinking about civic virtue, public good, right? And the ideas of civic virtue is that you might give of yourself in order to advance the health of the public, maybe above your own immediate personal interest. And then citizenship, roughly translated, means public life. So it's all about preparing citizens to participate in public life, to be voting members of the republic, to be representatives in a republic, to be leaders within the community. So that's what education is all about, preparing people for citizenship and instilling in them virtue, civic virtue. Right, so some classical republican thinkers and philosophers. The first is going to be Aristotle, right? A Greek philosopher alive from 384 to 322 BC. And he's really going to sort of lay the groundwork for sort of classical republican thought in ancient times. So he's going to talk about the three functions of government. He's going to say, look, there's three functions of government: to make the law, enforce the law, and interpret the law. Right? And this structure might look very familiar to you all. Hopefully it does. Right? The legislative function is to make the law. The executive function is to enforce the law, and the judicial function is going to be to interpret the law. So again, thousands of years ago, we're really going to have the basic framework for our constitutional system laid out here in antiquity. Aristotle's going to go further. He's going to break down different kinds of governments into good governments and bad governments. And he's going to come up with these three forms of government. So the first is going to be the rule of one, where you have a single individual ruling over a society or a government. Then you're going to have the rule of the few and the rule of the many. So we know who the one is: king, a monarch, authoritarian, whatever you want to call it, whatever kind of iteration of the rule of one is. Who are the few in society? If you have the rule of the few, who are the few? Yeah, rich people. People with means, people with wealth, the aristocracy as it might come to be called. And who are the many? Everybody else, the have-nots, right? So we're gonna have the rule of the one, the few, and the many. He's gonna break this down. He says, when you have a good version of government where you have rule of the one, we're gonna call it monarchy. When we have a bad version of that, we're gonna call it tyranny. When you have the few in charge, the rich, the nobles, the aristocrats, the good version is going to be called an aristocracy. The bad version is going to be called oligarchy. And then when you have the rule of many, the bad version is going to be called democracy. That's right. So classical Republicans are afraid of democracy. Many of our own framers and founders are afraid of democracy, at least untempered democracy. And we'll talk about sort of moderation in a moment. And then Aristotle's going to say, look, the good version of this, though, rule of the many, is going to be called polity, what he calls a mixed constitution. And this is where you can incorporate the rule of all three into one political system, where you can have the rule of one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. Now, as we're going to talk about in a few moments as well, we're going to see some sort of structure like this emerge in England during the feudal ages, where we're going to have the monarchy, but we're also going to have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, where we sort of get the rule of the few and the rule of the many as well, too. So we're talking about mixed polity or a mixed constitution. And so Aristotle's going to lay this out. Aristotle also talks about economic considerations. Remember, Aristotle's thinking about rationality. And what he says is, look, the most rational people in society are people of moderate amounts of wealth. What are rich people concerned with?
More money.
Yeah, or maintaining their status quo, right? At the end of the day, that's what they're worried about. They're maintaining their status quo. What are poor people worried about?
Getting money.
Getting money. It's the people in the middle class, people of moderate amounts of wealth who want least. They're the ones who are going to be most rational and also possess the most civic virtue. So Aristotle's sort of laying down these really, really important ideas that are going to really transcend the Middle Ages and show up here in colonial America in the 17th and 18th century. The Roman Republic. So the framers are going to be really concerned with the Roman Republic. Now, back then, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have television. You know what the founders did for fun? Right. They read about Roman history. So when they went to dinner parties and soirees, what they talked about? They talked about ancient Rome. They talked about Cicero. They talked about other classical republicans. They talked about ancient warfare, and that's how they got along. It's what they did for fun, right? They go get drunk and talk about Roman history. So again, they're going to look very closely to classical republicanism in Rome to really kind of like set the basis for the kind of society that they wanted to recreate. Many of them, like, they even feel like they're kind of like emulating this sort of classical republicanism of Rome. Many of them are slaveholders, just like the citizens were in Roman times. They live in small, somewhat homogenous, somewhat isolated communities. So for the founders, they were able to relate directly to ancient Rome. So, leads us to Republican government. Really, it can be used synonymously for all intents and purposes as a representative government. And there's going to become a preference for representative government coming out of ancient times and in the feudal times in Europe, particularly again in England. We're going to see this preference for Republican rule begin to grow. First slowly, and then rapidly as we progress through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. So, any questions? All right. So, again, the republicanization of monarchy, as Gordon would like to call it, 1215 to 1688 is when we're really going to see the monarchy in England start to republicanize. What we're going to do is we're going to start to see Parliament is going to begin to systematically and incrementally gain more and more rights and privileges from the king. So much so that by the time we get to the 17th century, the king in England's highly limited. It's not an absolute ruler, right? Not like in Russia under the Tsar's rule, where you have a complete, almost completely authoritarian absolute ruler. In England, the king is going to be highly limited by parliament. There will be civil wars. It will not be an easy process. Kings will try to take power from parliament, disband parliament. But at the end of the day, what we end up with is a limited monarchy, a republicanized monarchy in England by the time we get to the 17th century. So, and then of course, governmental innovation. Colonists are going to form their own classical Republican-style governments in the colonies. The very first colonial assembly is going to be the House of Burgesses, which is going to be formed in 1619, right? Just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. So here we're going to see sort of Republican government on full display. I wish I would.
Like 10 minutes.
Okay, so we're going to go quick. And then, of course, that brings us to sort of civic virtue in the 18th century. The founders really put a lot of emphasis on this idea of civic virtue. And what they sort of called the sort of disinterested man. And again, they really do believe that the people in society who should rule, should be making laws, should be people who are most disinterested. Usually this is going to be people of tremendous wealth and means who are sort of above the economic fray. They're above the hustle and bustle. They have so much money that they're leisured gentlemen, essentially. And because they're leisured, because they don't have to fight and claw their way for economic security, they're able to do what's best for the community. They're able to display the most civic virtue and be the most virtuous in society. And so again, there's going to be a major emphasis on creating this new classical Republican style government in the United States. Now, of course, it's important to note, by the time we get through with the Articles of Confederation, people like Madison and the like basically realize they become very jaded. They're like, yeah, that was a big mistake. Like, we can't rely on civic virtue in any way. Most people just don't have it. And then we're going to get the Constitution of 1787. But early on in the founding, this idea of civic virtue is incredibly important to the founders. They really think that they can create a society based on civic virtue. Okay, so what ideas about natural rights influenced the founders? So, natural rights philosophy, again, it's the idea that the individual is the most important sort of aspect in society. Emphasis on good government, emphasis on individual liberty and rights, and educating citizens so that they're aware of the rights, so that they can protect their own rights from authoritative or from abusive government. So obviously John Locke is going to be probably the most well-liked, I suppose you could say, natural rights philosopher of the bunch for the framers and founders of the United States government. So natural rights principles, people are sovereign, individuals are self-sufficient, government by consent, the rule of law, separate public and private spheres with an emphasis on security, liberty, and property. Let me break it down a little. So, Mr. Hobbes is going to be our sort of like first natural rights philosopher. He's going to come up with this idea of the state of nature, right? He sort of like thinks like, what would society be like if there essentially was no society? There was no government. If there were no rules. Basically, he says we're going to have this awful place called the state of nature. And he goes on to sort of explain what it is. He says in the state of nature, human life is, I love this, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, he says life's awful. Eventually, somebody's going to get the jump on you, and they're going to kill you in a really awful, violent way. And same with all of your family, right? And like that's what you have to hope for in a state of nature, all right? There's no morality. There's no rights. There's no art, culture, industry, commerce, time, writing, or exploration. You're in a perpetual state of war, and a constant fear of danger and a violent death persists at all times. So it's a pretty awful place. The Hobbesian state of nature. It's going to be quite different from the Lockean state of nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Hobbes would say, look, you want to leave the state of nature for obvious reasons. So you're going to leave the state of nature, you're going to form a social contract. People surrender their natural liberty to kill or do whatever the hell they want, and consent to an authoritarian state. He's going to call this state the Leviathan. Maintains order, stability, and peace, but rules by fear. The state creates societal structures and defines rights, if any exist at all. So again, the Leviathan provides stability and security, but not much else, right? So again, the Hobbesian view of sort of social contract theory, leaving the state of nature, is kind of bleak, especially when you look at what John Locke has to say. So Locke's going to come around a couple of years after Hobbes, and he's going to have a very different view of the state of nature. He's going to say, look, in a state of nature, people are free, equal, and rational. That's important, and rational. People have natural rights, life, liberty, and property. People have the right to punish those who do not follow reason or violate the rights of others. He says most people will seek personal advantage. Also, I don't have it on here, but for Locke, you are going to get conceptions of private property. And he basically says, look, when you toil, when you put your efforts into manipulating the natural world and you create something, that becomes your property, right? So when you mix your toil with the natural world, you get your own property. And you have a right to protect that property from somebody who would try to take it from you. He's going to say, look, you want to leave, you do at the end of the day want to leave the state of nature, right? You want to form a government. Unlike Hobbes, Locke's going to have two social contracts. The first social contract, you form a civil society. There's a law, judge, and executive working to maintain peace and safety for the public good. How many of you watched or have watched, what's the zombie show?
Walking Dead.
Yeah, The Walking Dead. Raise your hand. Walking Dead, you're familiar with it. Okay, so I like to think of like Rick and the crew, they're like a civil society, right? Like amongst themselves, they left the state of nature, right? Like they have rules, they try to follow it, they don't kill each other, they're looking out, protecting each other, they're fairly rational, but have they formed the actual government? No. So, but they formed the first social contract. They're out of the state of nature, they're in a civil society, they're not killing each other, right? But they do got to defend themselves against the state of nature that persists outside of their community. Locke says after you've formed a civil society, you can come up with a second social contract. This is going to form a government to protect the people's natural rights. There's going to be higher law, the rule of law as well, and popular sovereignty. Government by consent, and also the right to revolution, to throw off the bands of government if the government is not protecting the people's interests, which are protecting their natural rights. So, we can go quick.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. All right. So, what principles of classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy are incorporated into the British Constitution? I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, but if you're in Unit 1, you've got to know this, all right? We're going to look at America's founding documents, which are for the most part, the Declaration of Independence, early state constitutions, and then the Constitution of the United States. But if I'm a judge on Unit 1, I'm going to want to have a conversation with you about the British Constitution. I'm going to want you to tie it to the American Constitution, or the Constitution of 1787, and then I'm going to want you to tie it into today. So again, Unit 1, as Mr. Wood said, it's the foundation for which all the units operate on. And if you want to be the best Unit 6, you're going to have to tie it into Unit 1 and Unit 2. If you want to be the best Unit 5, Unit 4, the same thing. So make sure you have a very good, grounded foundation in British constitutionalism. It's hard for us as Americans in the 21st century to think about monarchy like as something that could be good, right? Like it's very like un-American to think about any kind of rule of one in any way, shape, or form. But it's important to remember, the American Revolution was not a repudiation of British monarchy or British constitutionalism, right? It was a reaffirmation of those. The reason why the founders rebelled is because they were being denied the very rights that were guaranteed to them under the British Constitution. They liked the British Constitution. They liked being citizens of Britain. And they wanted to remain so and enjoy the privileges such. And when they were denied those rights and those privileges, not just taxation without representation, but when they suffered under all kinds of tyrannical abuses, when they were deprived of their due process, that's when they rebelled. So, make sure you're good on the British Constitution. looks so fun, doesn't it? But we don't have time. Okay, what principles of classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy are incorporated into America's founding documents? So again, we have the Declaration of Independence, 1776, early state constitutions, which for the most part are going to be drafted almost immediately after the Declaration of Independence approved in the Second Continental Congress. People are going to leave that very afternoon. They're going to start going back to their states, start drafting state constitutions. And then of course, our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States, also referred to as the Constitution of 1787. So, classical republicanism. In early state governments, we're going to see homogeny, is that a word?
Yeah.
Homogeny, right? Again, we're talking about rigid citizenship, and I didn't mention this because we sort of skipped over the British system, but we're talking about rigid systems of citizenship based on race, gender, land ownership, all right? So people who were citizens in the British government, people who were citizens in early America, it's a very small, select group. So we should remember that. So homogeny, racial, religious, ethnic, rigorous citizenship requirements, small communities, and of course, this sort of heightened emphasis on civic virtue. Of course, Jefferson's notorious for believing that the yeoman farmer, the individual farmer, possessed the qualities to be the most virtuous person in sort of any kind of society. Of course, they owned slaves, but discussion for another day. Massachusetts State Constitution of 1780 is brilliant. I love it. It's a mixed constitution, and we don't see a lot of that. And John Adams is going to write the Massachusetts State Constitution in 1780. He takes the page right out of Aristotle, right? And kind of like emulates, in some respects, the British government as well too. He's going to have a strong executive, the first state constitution to do so, popularly elected with a one-year term. Okay. I should be clear though, the only people who could vote for the executive in the Massachusetts State Constitution in the 1780s were the richest individuals, right? So he's basically for the most part, he's gonna temper democracy with aristocracy. And so only the wealthiest individuals could vote for the executive. There's gonna be strong checks, a fixed salary, revised laws passed by legislature, and appoint officials and judges from the legislature. Again, there'd be a bicameral legislature. People of moderate amounts of wealth could vote for the upper house, and the people who didn't really have means could vote for the lower house. So everybody, in essence, was represented, but they were divided up based on their wealth in order to create this sort of mixed polity. It doesn't last long in Massachusetts, though. The Constitution's amended and they get rid of it. But in any case, it's cool. Constitution of the United States, preamble, the Senate, eligibility requirements to hold office, and then plenary legislative powers being left to the states are all examples of classical republicanism in the Constitution of the United States. And then natural rights philosophy. Early state governments, they're all going to be constitutions. They're going to be written. We're going to have social contract theory, limited government. All the state constitutions are going to begin with bills of rights that clearly list all of the rights, the enumerated rights of the people or of the citizens. And then, of course, we're going to have the rule of law. We don't have time for that. State declarations of rights. Some commonalities. We're going to have freedom of speech and press, the right to vote, free and frequent elections, the right of petition and redress, no taxation without representation, right to bear arms, due process protections are going to include right to counsel, protection from illegal searches and seizures, protection from forced self-incrimination, excessive bail fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. So again, here at the state level, we're going to see really the framework for our own United States Bill of Rights. Of course, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties is the first Bill of Rights in the colonies. You should make sure that you're very familiar with it as well, too. You should be able to thread a needle from the Magna Carta to the Petition of Right to the Habeas Corpus Acts to the English Bill of Rights to the early colonial constitutions to the early state constitutions to the early bills of rights at the states, and then all the way up to the Constitution of 1787 and the Bill of Rights that's going to be added after ratification, right? And then, of course, connect it all to today as well. So, in any case, if we had time, we'd go over this and be like, oh, what's classical republicanism, what's natural rights philosophy, but we don't got time for that. And then, of course, the Constitution of the United States, where do we see social contract theory? The preamble, it's a written constitution. We have separation of powers and checks and balances, legislative supremacy when they decide to do their job, right? And then election, impeachment, and removal. And I think this is my last slide. But I do want to say this, because I'll get on my soapbox because I can't help myself. Doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. Hopefully everybody in this room is concerned and worried about the aggressive and systematic attacks on our institutions of government. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. And you look, advanced citizenship is hard. It takes time, it takes effort. You got to stay involved, you got to stay vigilant. But we've seen attacks on our institutions, these very institutions. They're being undermined on a daily basis on the largest soapbox and bully pulpit in the world. And that should be concerning for everybody here, no matter where you land. So thank you for being here. Yeah, all right.
So hang on to those questions. Please do hang on to those questions. We're going to take a little bit of a break. What we're going to do after the break is we're going to have an alumni panel come up and reiterate and expand upon many of the concepts that Mr. Martinez just laid down. Keep in mind, and I know you guys are taking notes, that's fine, you're going to get all this content again. This is just to give you like a little bit of a head start on it. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. So
Remember.
all right. So, and you guys have a question? Do you have a question? All right. Okay. So what we're going to be doing now is, as we did last week, we have an alumni panel, an all-star alumni panel, and an all-star alumni panel of judges. They're going to demonstrate and model some of the good Be the People behaviors that we seek to enforce or encourage in this program. They have taken their time out of their summer to get no credit whatsoever and write an entire testimony about a subject that none of them are super excited about, or none of them were in Unit 1. So
I love classical republicanism.
So what they're going to do is they're going to introduce themselves, or first the judges are going to introduce themselves. We're going to model this like a regular hearing. First, the judges are going to introduce themselves. They're going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves. They're going to read the question, and then we'll get started. Ms. McGraw is going to be your timer. Yeah, make sure that you identify yourselves as what unit you're in, what school you're going to, and all that. Okay. Judges?
Good morning. My name is Zoe. I was a Unit 1 alum for the last session. But I'm excited to see what you've prepared for us today.
I'm Emma, and I'm a Unit 4 alum from Amador.
I'm Shriti, Unit 5 alum from Amador.
Gabby, Unit 6 alum from Amador.
Introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Dahlia Hoffman. I'm an alumni from Foothill as.
Hi, I'm Izzy Fernandez, and I was an alum for it.
Hello, I'm Sandra Chen, Unit 5 Amador.
Hi, I'm Jessica Stubbs, Unit alum 5.
And I'm Aaron Guerra, Unit 6 alum from Foothill. We'd like to thank the judges, the audience, and the timekeeper, and thank CACE for having us here today.
All right, your question today is the only question. How do America's founding documents reflect a classical Republican commitment to civic duties? In what ways do they fail to do so? Begin when you're ready.
The purpose of the government, according to James Madison and Federalist 10, is to secure the public good and private rights. The Founding Fathers sought to combine a participatory government that emphasized the common good with the protection of natural rights, which is reflected in the structure and purposes of government. By promoting national unity and the responsibilities of citizens, America's founding documents reflect a classical Republican commitment to civic duties. However, this commitment is undercut by an even stronger emphasis on individual liberty.
In creating the new American government, the Founding Fathers referred to both classical republicanism and natural rights philosophies. According to Aristotle, a classical republican government exists to promote a common good, which he defines as reaching the good life for its citizens. In a classical republic, citizens have a strong sense of community and make sacrifices for institutions and policies that benefit all. On the other end of the spectrum, according to John Locke, natural rights government exists to maximize individual liberties. It has little interference in the lives of citizens.
One founding document that clearly reflects a classical Republican commitment to civic duties is the Constitution, most poignantly the preamble with its emphasis on national unity. The Constitution was a metamorphosis from a loose coalition of states into a powerful national government that would promote a shared community through civic responsibilities. The preamble of the Constitution cites general welfare and a more perfect union, echoing classical Republican philosophy. The founders recognized that a strong central government was necessary to promote the interests of all people.
Further, the body of the Constitution enshrined rights of voting for both representatives and the president into the hands of the people, a right now considered one of the most sacred civic duties. Article 1, Section 2 gives the people the right to elect their representatives, while Article 2, Section 1 provides for the election of the president. While the right to vote has changed over the years, its inclusion in the Constitution applies directly to the definition of a republic, a government of the people.
However, other founding documents fail to reflect classical republicanism and instead emphasize natural rights philosophy. For example, the Declaration of Independence demonstrates more natural rights influence by emphasizing the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As Princeton professor Julian Boyd states, Thomas Jefferson believed full freedom allows individuals to pursue their own fulfillment. In this way, the happiness of the individual is placed above the common good.
Furthermore, many of the founding fathers were very wary of a large central government, such as the model of the British Empire. Thus, anti-federalists enshrined protections of the individual into the Bill of Rights, protecting natural rights of individuals over the common good. This included obvious protections, such as the First Amendment freedoms, as well as the implicit protections, such as the right to privacy, found in the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments. These rights do not aid the common good, but rather the rights of the individual.
Finally, I believe many of the electoral systems in the Constitution, while showing a commitment to civic duties, do not show the same commitment to the ideas of classical republicanism. The Electoral College, for example, does not show commitment to the idea that all men are created equal, as the system unfairly favored rural areas at the time of the founding and still does today. Further, the system for electing senators laid out in the Constitution gave the power to legislators of the state, not individuals. It was not until over a century later when the election of senators was given to the people.
Overall, many of the founding documents aim to promote civic duty, yet the overshadowing of the protection of individual liberties interferes with this goal. The effects of documents that succeeded in promoting civic participation can be seen in the expansion of the right to vote throughout our country's history, such as the 15th and 19th Amendments.
Current-day failures of the sentiment of civic duty are seen in the barriers put in place that don't allow all people to participate. The lack of protection to minority groups in our founding documents allows current-day policies, such as voter ID laws and purging voter rolls, to limit their participation. Civic participation was and continues to be an essential part of our government, but in order to have a free and fair society, individual rights and equality must be protected as well. Thank you.
Okay, so between natural rights and classical republicanism, which one prevails today and which one should prevail?
I think that natural rights philosophy is more prevalent in our current day society, and we can see this in the emphasis of individual rights, for example, free speech. In the case of Texas v. Johnson, 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that flag burning was acceptable under the First Amendment, and this can be seen as detracting from the common good and the national unity for the sake of individual expression.
I would have to agree with Sandra that current natural rights philosophy has usurped the classical republicanism ideals that were embedded in our Constitution. Harvard law professor Michael Sandel said in his book, Democracy's Discontent, that the leaders of our country's current individual values have overshadowed the common good, and we can look to the current stagnation in Congress to see why natural rights philosophy is impacting the classical republicanism ideals.
I would agree with my panel mates, but further that classical republicanism really should be focused on in today's society. In looking at Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, we can see that American society has fallen apart since the middle of the 20th century, and that we've seen that there's been a decrease in communities, decrease in civic virtue, and this sort of civic virtue that we used to see in America isn't there anymore. And I believe that a resurgence of that, similar to the way Putnam described in his book, would be beneficial to American society.
So how do we do that? How do we create more classical republicans?
I think the first step to doing this would be promoting more civic education. As of now, according to the Brookings Institute, only about half of the states have a sufficient state-sponsored civic education program. I think we should look to both Idaho and Colorado, which according to a Pew Research study have two of the strongest civic education programs in the state. I think we should be modeling this in all of our states.
I would agree with Golly. I think another step to bringing back some more classical republicanism is reforming our current campaign system for people, for congressmen and such, as right now it is mostly focused on their re-election and not promoting things that are good for the people, passing laws that would benefit the people and promote the common good. And so I think that is a big reform.
So how do you guys perform your civic duties and engage as citizens?
I believe the right to have your voice heard is one of the most important rights a citizen has. San Francisco, in a city near where I come from, actually has a lot of protests and vocalizations of your opinion. And I've attended many of these, and I think that the ability to have your First Amendment freedom of speech is really important in today's society, especially if you don't believe in what the government is really doing.
I think another big part of civic virtue is following the laws that are in place in our country. So even simple things as not going to the grocery store and stealing something off the shelf, and following those guidelines and exercising your right to vote under that as well, I think is one of the most important.
And to build off of that, the responsibility and the duty of citizens to register to vote and to vote in elections, I think is one way in which people can participate in their government most directly. And even though I'm not yet 18 and eligible to vote, I have pre-registered, and this is a way that I can show my civic responsibility.
I agree. Even though most of us cannot vote at the time, we can still advocate for more responsive government. So, for example, after the Stoneman Douglas shooting, I helped organize a school walkout to help advocate for our Congress representative, Eric Swalwell, as well as our state and national government, to provide policies that can ensure that violence and guns stay out of schools.
Which branch is best able to protect this common good that you guys are talking about?
I think that the branch most capable of protecting the common good would be the judicial branch. I think in decisions such as Obergefell v. Hodges 2015, they are able to protect the rights of specific minorities that weren't protected in our founding documents and allow, for example, same-sex couples to have the right to marry.
I would disagree with Golly. I find that the political question doctrine has really limits the judicial branch's ability to speak on some of these matters, such as the common good. I feel that the common good is a changing definition. The common good in the 17th century, for example, may have allowed for slavery, but that obviously would be unacceptable today. I feel that the legislative branch and their power to write laws and dictate what people should do would be the most powerful branch in dictating the common good and how American citizens should be acting.
I agree with Aaron, as our congressional representatives are the most directly elected. And so in that way, we can see that they can be a reflection of the will of the people and the common good. And the Senate, being representative of the states, continues on the ideas of a small, more homogenous community that ancient philosophers imagined when they were talking about classical republicanism.
And the executive, do you think they play a role at all in protecting the common good, or does it really just rely upon either the judicial or the legislature?
I think the executive does play some role in promoting the common good. As we can see with the bureaucracy, they are the enforcers of the laws, so they make sure that the laws Congress passes are implemented correctly and are safe for the people and work well for the people. And so I think in that way, though Congress is passing those laws, that the executive branch's job is to make sure that those are implemented correctly for the people.
Time.
We have feedback.
Good stuff. I think what I really liked during Q&A is that whoever was
isn't necessarily something we're conscious of, like as judges, but then when you see that everybody's focused on this here, it's really nice as a judge to see that everyone is.
And another thing that like they did well that like all of you guys should like definitely try to do is in Q&A with participation. Like the first question, Jessica and Sandra kind of took that one. So then on the next question, they kind of like held back and then let Golly and Izzy kind of go. So that's something that like is really good to do, is to make sure that everyone can speak once before you go again.
Yeah, and kind of relating to that, they did a really good job of building off of each other. You mentioned the judiciary, and he said he disagreed. And that's a really good thing, not just disagreement, but throughout the Q&A, even though they work from two different schools, they work together like as a team, and it's like they've been practicing this for like a bit. That's what it felt like at least. And so the way they built off of each other was, I thought, really good.
I really liked, so this question is primarily Unit 1, but a lot of the questions we gave them were not Unit 1, like we gave them a Unit 6 question, Unit 4 question, and stuff, and they acted like it was no big deal. They had evidence for everything, and it's because even if you're in a single unit, you're going to deal with material from other units. You're never truly 100% just philosophy or just a system of government. Like, you have to learn about everything. So I think they did that really well.
But like just to highlight a couple of things that are relevant to what we're going to be doing today. So, for example, you heard a lot of evidence, types of evidence. I don't know if anybody was looking at that types of evidence sheet. I was kind of looking at it out of the corner of my eye, and I can check off almost all of those types of evidence. It wasn't just court cases. It wasn't just constitutional citations. They had constitutional application. You talked about some founding documents, and specifically where in the founding documents you can find those constitutional applications. And they gave you reasoning. So here are some of the reasons why classical republicanism is not being protected nowadays as it could be. Or here is a reason why I disagree that the judicial branch is not protecting that in the way that I think it should be. So those are the things that they modeled for you that you guys should hopefully internalize and are going to, when we do break you up into your units, into your individual units later today, that you guys can emulate, I think. So anybody else have any other CACE folks have any feedback on how they did? No? Okay. All right. Okay. So good job, guys. You can. Nice work. What's that? You can leave it here. Yeah. If you need to, yeah. So yeah.
It's everything.
So the next thing that we wanted to do is, I know you guys have had a lot of questions so far. There's some questions that were asked last week. I know you guys have more questions going forward as to, kind of like tips and tricks as to what are some of the things that really good We the People teams do? What are some of the things that really good We the People think teams do not do? And we can answer some questions that you guys may have. One thing that I did want to highlight is when we got feedback a little bit last week, there was some folks who, when they gave us their feedback sheets, wanted to know how to write a testimony. We're not going to go into that very much today, partially because you guys are nowhere near the point where you're going to be writing testimony. We will have a testimony writing workshop like in October-ish. We'll schedule that where you guys can come back and go in detail as to how to write a testimony. Way to do it, there's a way not to do it, and we'll go over that now. But in general, what we want to do is talk about some of the other things that We the People teams do. We're going to hand it over to Tuva, who can hopefully talk about that. We have a handout for you as well. Somewhere. We'll find it. Go ahead.
Yeah. Cool. First of all, thank you all for being here. I know it's early, but like you're gonna get used to this, and we're gonna meet with your schools individually, and so this is nice that you all get sort of a precursor from. So part of the reason we're having this talk about like what tips and tricks will makes you successful so early on in the process is that you'll get a feeling and an understanding of what we as judges look for. So typically, CACE, we help you all, but we also will judge at, competitions like district, regionals, and state. And it kind of gives you some insight into not just what we think, but what we've seen has worked really well in state and other competitions. But it's not just about writing testimony. This is more to give you a sense of, like, here's some things that good units do to collect some light. So the first thing that you can do, not only is just like we the people students, but just as like good, engaged civic humans, is consume about like 3 to 4 news sources a day. So for some people it's podcasts, for other people it's like reading the paper, for other people it's just reading online articles. It's important to sort of get a wide variety of the sources that you're getting in. So you may have political leanings one way, but it also might be helpful for you to read someone who maybe differs from you ideally. So if you wanted my recommendations for good sources of news, I do think that like more unbiased news sources are like NPR, the PBS NewsHour I think is great. They kind of do a good job of bringing on different or people of different ideologies. So like Brooks and Shields are pretty much a staple on that show, and they're more conservative, so they lie somewhere in the middle. But I would also, if you're interested in more like podcasty type stuff, I would recommend the NPR Politics podcast. 538 has a great politics podcast as well. And then if you're interested in something that's more broad-based that covers a lot of the topics we talk about in We the People, there's this new podcast earlier this year called Let's Get Political. It covers everything at a very high level, but think of like 2 dope queens mixed with civic ed, which is cool. It's pretty informative, but all of these are sort of at a high level, so this just gives you a sense of like what's going on. You kind of have to do more research to dig a little bit deeper, and then share this amongst your peers. Make sure that if you find something interesting or relevant, post it in your Slack channels. Have we talked about Slack?
Yes. How many people here are already in the We the People Slack that we've set up? Almost everybody. Okay. If you're not, you have an email that is set. We will be posting stuff that happens in the Slack, in the various unit channels. It's usually, so like we will do that. You guys can look at it. Other schools can look at it. But, you guys should use whatever you guys use, whether that's a Google Hangout or whatever it is. You can use the Slack that we set up for you guys if you want. That's fine. To repost those and talk about stuff that's going on.
Probably this has literally been the one thing that stuck with me since I started this in 2014. Like, I remember my teacher at the time told us to like every single major news source on like Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and then just naturally your feed is just going to turn into an actual news feed, right? And then like you get like the day's news like by the time you wake up, because most of it's on Eastern time, and it's like really helpful just to like just passively, okay, like what's happening today and how can I incorporate that into my testimony. And I mean, to this day, I still use that same news feed where I'm getting news from. So, yeah, I mean, just trying to incorporate it into your daily lives too. I mean, probably not too much because otherwise you're going to be really depressed. But it's definitely helpful when it's not just from like Slack or anything else, and it's actually part of your day.
I would just add to that, be wary of headlines, assuming the headline is the news, because editors write really bad headlines that are, and especially about Supreme Court rulings, the headlines often are not really what the Supreme Court ruled on. It's much more nuanced. So if it's something relevant to your unit or your question, make sure you dig a little deeper. You don't just assume that the headline is the answer to the question.
Also, a lot of this news can be really overwhelming if you just try and sign up for everything right away. So feel free to just do it in little pieces and slowly gain more information. The podcasts Super recommended are excellent, but if you want like a 15-minute news daily, Up First by NPR is a great way to sort of get started and start the day, and then you can sort of build from there the kind of news you consume.
All of that.
I would just add very quickly, in my Bible class, and I actually pay for it because I'm a literal person, but I also acknowledge that you don't necessarily expert when it comes to I cannot officially endorse fun workarounds to make the New York Times work, even when it's supposed to be blocking you, but I'm sure your ears can be helped out.
That's a great call out. I was just about to point out, I know a lot of things
cheaper students. So if you are a heavy user, it might be worthwhile to do that. All right, so I know you all have lots of questions about testimonies. That is a big part of We the People, but at least in the initial stages, it's a lot of information gathering. So when it comes to your actual testimony, it's basically an umbrella and your sub-bullet points. You really want to outline your questions before you start writing, because the outlining process tells you exactly what the question is asking for. Like, that's what you're trying to do. There's sort of two layers to every, like, We the People testimony writing session. And at the first level, just getting to the first level, which is literally answering the question, is the bulk of the work. I would say that 80% of the work that you do on writing your testimony is literally directly answering the question. That last 20% is refining and getting to, like, the core of, like, what the question is asking and, like, that extra oomph. But the point of outlining is so that you can start with sort of a thesis, because the point of a good testimony is basically to weave your thesis through every single part, so it's very clear to the judges that this is this is what you came here to say. Like, this is the argument that you're trying to make, and it is evident in every part of your question. And to that point of, like, reading different sources and reading, having arguments and counter arguments, you still want it to be very clear to the judges what you think is the right way to approach the problem of the question. And so starting with an outline gives you a sense of, like, formulating those opinions and thoughts in sort of a structured way. As you're going through that outlining process, talk to your teammates about what happens before, during, and after you write that testimony, because the amalgamation of the ideas all together can sometimes muddle your thoughts. So, but the more that you talk when you're writing them, the more clear the sides you will have, like, in your pocket. So, one of, like, the key tips that we recommend when you're actually, you know, in Q&A is you always want to be balanced. You want to present both sides, and that should also apply to your testimony. So if someone is, you know, pro the Federalists, you should also have a quip as to, like, why the anti-Federalists, you know, were reasonable in their logic and should support the anti-Federalists and Lefty Hamilton. But yes, so, you know, being balanced is very, very important. It gives you more bonus points. Secondly, with regards to the testimonies, once you've actually written them, get a lot of feedback. People tend to interpret things very differently. So when you're all sitting in a room, like 4 or 5 of you, put together this testimony that you think is amazing, but if you go to another unit or your teacher, they may think differently, and it's important to incorporate their feedback into how your testimony is presented, because they may come at it with a different perspective that might help you either inform your opinions, change your opinions. So as much as you can, try and consume a lot of that. I would say that to a certain degree, at some point, you're going to stop. That's going to happen naturally, but at least in the very initial stages, try and get as much feedback as you can, because it'll make you better, basically.
If I can add on that really quickly. There are going to be times when you're going to ask one person and they're going to say, that testimony was great. And then another person who's going to say, that testimony was awful. It sucked. There is going to be a lot of times where you get conflicting information. You're going to want to have to critically analyze which part of that is right. And if you have questions, the ultimate person to ask is your teacher, right? Like, person A said, ditch this. Person B said, keep it. Ask your teacher as to whether or not they want to, like, which way you guys want to go. All right.
Take what we say also with a grain of salt. We've been doing this a while, but there are going to be points where you might just have a fundamental difference of opinion, and that is okay as long as you can back that up.
Totally.
And so, brings us to another great point. You should always ask us for help. So we have the Slack channel set up for all of you to join. Your teachers are definitely your sort of first point of contact, because you see them every day and you cannot see us every day. But we're pretty responsive on that Slack or over email. We try and have everything go through the Slack now, just so that all the wealth of knowledge can be shared. But that's why we're here. Like, that's why we're doing this. Otherwise, we would not be here on a Saturday. Because it's really like this.
Can I make a Slack comment?
Yes.
If you have a question about a testimony or something to do with your question, and you want to direct it to one of us specifically, that's okay, but still post it in the general Slack channel, or like not the general, but the one for your individual unit, as opposed to sending a direct message to one of us. And the reason for that is sometimes we just don't have the time. The one individually directing your question doesn't have the time to respond. But Clint might see a question directed to Vikram, and then Clint will provide a response. And maybe you're looking for something from Vikram that can help you if Vikram's busy.
So I think in terms of what we look for from the testimony directly is, like, if you observe a problem, like a good team will say, like, this is a problem for this reason. A great team will tell you, this is a problem, but this is how we believe there are steps that we can take to mitigate this problem. So the difference between the two is that one provides a problem and a solution, and the other one just states the problem. Great teams always want to provide some sort of insight or fix to whatever problem they're observing. So, like, a lot of times we talk about gridlock in Congress. So if you just say that there's gridlock in Congress, that doesn't do it much for me. Like, it doesn't tell me enough. It doesn't give me, like, gives me some knowledge that you know what's going on. But if you give me a solution to gridlock in Congress, and please, talk to your representative to make that happen. But if you can provide me with some sort of concrete detail or some sort of plan, like a la Elizabeth Warren's, like, 8 plans to fix everything in the universe, like, that gives me something to like hold on to. It gives you bonus points when it comes to that reasoning piece because you're going that extra step. And along those lines, it's also important to make sure, I think I said this before, but like address both sides, because that's also giving you a bunch of reasoning points. Because it shows me that you've thought about the question and you're taking the stance that you're taking in spite of the counter argument, which may or may not think is strong for whatever reason. Then I think in terms of what you can do as your unit to like make your unit more cohesive and strong is you can work with other units within your class. So I think we brought this up in the alumni panel. Martinez brought it up. Like, the way that you get better is by pulling information from other units. So you may be a unit 5er and you might like love court cases, like that is your area of expertise, but it's helpful to understand, unit 3, talking about like what sort of amendments have come through the court. Why did those amendments come about? What was the sort of impetus for those things happening? And so showing that you have knowledge of other units is super impressive. And I think Unit 1 sort of is from which like all of this stuff is stemmed. So I would hope that all the units have some sort of semblance of knowing like the major philosophers, because at some point it's gonna come up, whether it's Q&A at district or regionals or even state or nationals, like it's gonna come up. Like, why do we have these rules and institutions in place? It's all Unit 1. So I would say work together, work with your other units. You can switch off when you're actually reading testimony and get feedback from one another. And usually it's a good time to like get, Unit 1 might know examples that Unit 5 doesn't have, and Unit 5 might give Unit 1 examples, stuff like that. I'm not just picking like Unit 1 and Unit 5 to do this all, but it's just for the sake of argument. All right, and then the last major one that I have is you should like have fun with your unit. Like, that's really important because unit cohesion actually translates a lot in that Q&A discussion. So like, if you like each other and you're like smiling at each other, that makes a huge difference in the way that like you communicate with each other on that panel. So like, hang out with each other. Like, we used to go to Fiesta Taco. Does that still exist? Is that still around? Burritos the size of a baby? Yeah. So we used to do that, and we used to like eat noodles at someone's house. Like, that was like our legit fun activity. But you can do other things with your unit that are non-people related, and I know like last year's class will tell you it's kind of easy to get sucked into a lot of this stuff. Like, you will spend like many hours doing this. So like, take some time for yourselves. You're also like high school seniors. Like, you can have fun. Like, you've earned it after 3 years of high school. So like, take time to like make sure that you all are okay, and like don't just let this become your life, because it is very easy to. And then we're the recovering addicts who do this for fun. True.
Recovering.
Perpetuating.
Yeah. So, okay. So with that,
Does anybody have any questions on anything that Suba said, or any other questions about how Q&A should go generally? There's a question right there.
So the panel did a really good job of how we
Yeah, I think that the way that the panel modeled it was really, really well done. Like, here's the thing with the disagreement is that you can't, like, you can say, I believe X, and then your colleague can say, well, I disagree with my panel mate, I believe Y. The first panel mate should not be like, well, yeah, but what about this? You know, like, it should not turn into a debate among panel mates. You can just disagree, state a disagreement. I think sometimes stating disagreements, even in testimonies, is really powerful as a way to, like, kind of demonstrate that you understand both sides of an argument or multiple sides of an argument.
The important point there is that you're not arguing about it, you're presenting sides of an argument, right? That's a very important distinction. So the point about, like, you shouldn't be debating each other is that, like, you don't go back and forth. They're like, I have this piece of evidence, you have that piece of evidence. There's an issue we're discussing. Here's one side of that argument that person one is presenting, and then person two presents the other side of the argument. That's sort of the extent of the disagreement. And then people can provide evidence and supporting facts and whatever that fall on both sides of that, but it's not like a debate like you would do in speech and debate where you're like, aha, I have this, this trump card that's going to make my point better than your point. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to present the whole argument with both sides.
That being said, you can bicker offline.
Yes.
And that is the best way to push all of your teammates to really understanding where they're coming from and why they're saying their things. So get the bickering done, just not in the presentation itself.
That's why we want you to talk about all of these points beforehand, so that, like, like, if Sabrina and I fundamentally disagree, we've already disagreed offline, like, I know it's coming. Like, I know that Sabrina's going to say, Federalists are awesome, and I'm like, nah, anti-Federalists are what's up. But we know that. We know that going in, and we know that, like, having both of us present will make that, like, whole argument a lot stronger.
And the back and forth that you're looking for is really between you and the judges, and not you and your. Obviously very respectful with the judge's light, but you're trying to start that conversation that you almost forget that you're in this formal back and forth, and having disagreement among panel mates is a way to sort of hook judges' attention and get them invested in the arguments you're making, because they can push on the points that are being made, and then you get that back and forth going with the judges.
I love drama.
Great question. Any other questions? Right there.
So the panel did a really good job of all of the evidence. There are lines between that and drop a bunch of
Yes. So the question is there a line between effective use of evidence and too much evidence? Yes, absolutely. I can tell you I judged Unit 5s a lot at the state level. And sometimes Unit 5s are like a machine gun of case law. It's just like case. And man, it gets overwhelming because it's like, okay, you're not applying that case. You're just listing a bunch of First Amendment cases, and I don't really care about that. So yes, there is a line, and you'll figure out that line. Usually, one of the things we say is you shouldn't be making a point without use of evidence, and you want to not. The point is not giving the most evidence, it's giving the best evidence for your point, okay? Sometimes that evidence is, like, super basic. It's, like Article 1, Section 1, Article 1, Section 9, those sorts of really, really basic, this is what the answer is. Sometimes it's the best evidence is an esoteric philosopher or a unique case. You just have to figure it out.
Honestly, football has been what we aspire to is, and honestly, the more you see, the more you talk about here. It's going to sound dumb, but the best presentations are almost ballet. It's like a ballet. You essentially are in front of the judge, and you're standing looking at the and they know what you're talking about. So the very best presentations, ones that I love and that you come out of like, oh my god, that was like special, feels like you're just trying to memorize. That kind of takes away from it. Now, granted, there's